Hello, you are listening to the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Carrigan, medical intuitive healer, Amazon #1 best-selling author. You can find out more about me and my work at catherinecarrigan.com and unlimitedenergynow.com. While you're there, definitely sign up for my newsletter so you can learn even more about how you can heal yourself naturally. Now, I've got a special guest for you today. It's me. Now, I'm going to be talking about a very sensitive subject, which is how you can tell if you are being abused. Now, I want to start by giving a warning to all of my very sensitive listeners and viewers. If you are a highly sensitive person, you may not want to listen to what I have to say, or you may want to take breaks as I am talking about a very challenging subject, which is the subjects of abuse and the subjects of domestic violence. So first of all, I have to give you my personal history. So I am now 65 years old. And when I was about 30 years old, I got married and I spent 2 years in a support group for battered women. Okay. Now, and I almost have to take a deep breath, even as I think of this time of my life. So the individual who hit me and with whom I was in an abusive relationship is no longer alive. He is deceased. Interestingly, if you understand medical intuitive healing, and if you understand reading the body, he actually died of gallbladder cancer, stage 4 gallbladder cancer. And the emotion behind gallbladder is actually rage. So clearly this was an issue that he had dealt with throughout his life. And even now, even though he is deceased, there's still a slight amount of fear in my heart as I talk about this. So please bear with me as I share with you about how you can tell if you're being abused. So again, I spent 2 years in a support group for battered women at age 30. And it was thanks to a support group for the YWCA, through the YWCA, that I actually began to heal from that. And even though it was probably the most challenging time in my life, it was a major turning point for me. And I remember writing in my journal at the time about all the horrible things that had happened to me. And I remember writing to myself in my journal, this is ridiculous. I actually want to be happy. And I remember thinking, I don't really know how to be happy, but I want to be happy. And it was by setting my intention at that time that I wanted to be happy that I began to turn my life around. So I have great gratitude for the YWCA and everything I learned. So I'm going to be sharing with you about the wheel of power and control. And if you're listening to this broadcast, anybody can Google the wheel of power control. So let's talk about, first of all, what is the wheel of power and control? So the wheel of power and control, it's a diagram that you can come up with, and it was put together by domestic violence advocates. And it helps people, both men and women, recognize and pinpoint signs and signals that you may be being abused. Now, the great poet T.S. Eliot had a saying. He said, humankind can't bear very much reality. And as I look back on that time in my life, I was a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Brown University. I gave the Phi Beta Kappa speech when I graduated from Brown University. And I remember sitting in my meetings for other women who had been in domestic violence. And these were women from the projects, women from the finest homes in Nashville, Tennessee, from the projects to the palaces. And we were all going through the same thing. And even though I had a high degree of education and was and hopefully still am a highly intelligent person, every week, I and the rest of the women, we'd have trouble remembering. And I just bring this up because if you're being abused, it's very, very difficult to face the reality of what you're going through. It's painful to look at. But in order to heal from abuse, your very first step is to recognize what are the signs that you're being abused. So then when it's happening, you can make choices for yourself to stop the situation. So the wheel of power and control. And I'm doing a broadcast, an audio broadcast, and also a video. But again, I encourage you to download the wheel of power and control. So I'm going to describe it. It's a circle. And on the outside of the circle is physical and sexual violence. So one of the questions that you may have is, if I'm not being physically harmed, am I still being abused? If I'm not being physically harmed, am I still being abused? In other words, if no one's hitting you or no one's raping you, are you being abused? And the answer is actually possibly yes. So I'm going to be going through these particular spokes of the wheel and power control. Bear with me. If you need to take a break while I talk about this, it's okay. Take a break whenever you need to. And just realize I told you the story about myself so that even though I was Phi Beta Kappa from graduate of Brown University, I sat there literally week after week and I couldn't remember it all because it is so difficult to wrap your head around the concept that you may be in an abusive relationship and all the ramifications of that for you, for your children, and the rest of your family. So let's talk about why people do these techniques. Before I go in through these steps, the reason that people use abuse is to get power and control over you. So these are all different techniques that someone could use, abusive techniques. And the goal of these techniques is to get power and control over you. So I myself need to take a little bit of breath, okay, before I talk about this. And if you're listening, maybe you need to take a couple of breaths also. All right, so the first spoke in this wheel is using coercion and threats. So this would be making or carrying out threats to do something to hurt you. It could be threatening to leave you, to commit suicide, to report you to welfare, or in one of the wheels of power and control that I saw is using citizenship or residency privilege. So if you are an immigrant or if your legal status may be somewhat questionable, someone could be threatening you with that in order to get control over you, using coercion and threats, threatening to report you to welfare, making you drop charges. So this would be if you have called the police in the past about an incident of domestic violence, threatening you so that you drop the charges, or actually making you do illegal things, carrying a gun, making you carry firearms, making you do drug deals so that they have power and control over you, so they have dirt on you, so that they can have leverage over you. All right. Now, the next spoke in the wheel of power and control is using intimidation. And as you learn about these abusive techniques, there's a lot of similarities. So using an intimidation, making you afraid, and this could be even without using words, giving you a dirty look, actions or gestures, smashing things. Okay. I remember a family member that I grew up with, if he didn't like what you were doing, he would smash things. I remember he threw a bed across a room one time when he wasn't happy with a choice that I'd made. destroying your property, abusing pets. And this can be super painful. So they may know that one way of getting to you is by abusing your beloved animals, displaying weapons, displaying knives or guns, okay, holding a gun to your head. Okay, now another very common spoke in the wheel of power and control is using emotional abuse, putting you down, making you feel bad about yourself, calling you names, making you think you're crazy, playing mind games, gaslighting you, humiliating you, or making you feel guilty. So if anybody is doing any of these things to you, you are being abused, and that's emotional abuse. Now, the next spoke in the wheel is using isolation. And I remember years ago, I had a client who was in an abusive marriage, and I was going over the wheel of power and control with her. And her husband at the time would take the car, they had one car, and leave her there by herself for days. That's using isolation. So using isolation, controlling what you do, who you see and who you talk to, okay? What you read or where you go, all right? And if you notice, one of the commonality here is your abusers want to keep what's happening secret because they don't want you to get help, because they don't want anybody to know and throw you a lifeline. Limiting your outside involvement, using jealousy to justify their actions. So they may say, well, I'm not letting you go someplace because, you know, I might get jealous. Well, again, if they're isolating you from friends, from family, from people who can help you, that is definitely a form of abuse. Now, the next step is in the wheel of power and control is minimizing, denying, and blaming. So this would be making light of the abuse. It's like, well, you know, I didn't kill you, or, oh, you only have a few bruises on your arms, or, oh, it wasn't that bad, right? And not taking your concerns about it seriously. Saying the abuse didn't happen. It's like, I never hit you. You know, I didn't hurt your dog. That must have been someone else. Shifting responsibility for abusive behavior. It's blaming it on something else. And also saying that it's your fault, that you caused it. Now, the next spoke in the wheel of power control is using children. And if you don't have children, again, this could be using your pets, making you feel guilty about the children. And I think that the reason that so many people don't leave abusive relationships is because they are afraid of what would happen to their children. But I'll never forget when I was in the support group for battered women, one of the things that I would do is once a week, I would volunteer at the shelter and I would babysit for the children who had been living in abusive relationships so that their mothers could go to their own support group. And even though I wasn't a psychologist, I'm not a psychologist even today, you could be with these children and they would be pre-verbal, even just little kids. And you could tell that they had been grown up. They've been living in a violent household, and they were themselves were deeply affected by what's been happening. And so when you love your children, it's normal and natural for you as a normal person to want to protect your children. And part of what you need to do to protect your children is actually to get out of that situation as soon as you are able. So using the children to relay messages. So they'll tell a child, you know, this is what I said, rather than telling you and communicating with you directly. Using visitation to harass you, threatening to take the children away. Like, if you leave me, I'll take the children and you'll never see them. Okay. Now, the next spoke in the wheel of power control is using male privilege. So this would be treating you like a servant, making all the big decisions. In other words, not treating you as an equal, as the equal partner that you deserve to be, acting like the master of the castle, being the person who defines men and women's roles. So in a healthy partnership, each part of the partnership, each member of the partnership gets to decide, how do we want to live our lives? So when one person makes all the rules, that can be a sign of using male privilege, and that is definitely a sign of abuse. Now, the last spoke in this wheel of power and control that I'm going to be talking about is using economic abuse. So this could be preventing you from getting or keeping a job. It's like, I don't want you to get out of the house. I'm not going to allow you to earn your own money. Making you ask for money. In other words, rather than, if you're all living in the house and there's normal expenses for gas, groceries, rent, mortgage, etc., making you ask for that rather than taking care of things automatically, giving you an allowance, taking your money. It's like you may be working and earning a good living, but if your partner is taking all that money, that is, or part of that money, that is a sign of abuse. Not allowing you to know about or have access to family income. So your partner may be earning a good income, but if they don't share it with you, if they're not sharing the information about it with you, about how much he or she makes, and allowing you to share with that for equal responsibility, then that may be a sign that you are actually being abused. And as I mentioned, in some of the wheels of power and control, they also have a spoke about using citizenship or residency privilege. So this would be failing to file papers to legalize your immigration status, withdrawing or threatening to withdraw papers filed for your residency. So if someone is holding your legal status against you, then that may be a sign that you're being abused. And with that, let's take a break and listen to a message from one of our commercial sponsors here at UK Health Radio. My name is Catherine Carrigan, medical intuitive healer, Amazon #1 best-selling author. We'll be right back. So the next question that I want to talk to you about is, what kind of people abuse other people? Now, I started this broadcast by quoting T.S. Eliot, who said that humankind cannot bear very much reality. And when you recognize that you are living in an abusive relationship, that can be quite extremely devastating emotionally, and it can be very difficult to face on any level. But what you have to see is that if you are in an abusive relationship, that normal people do not abuse others. So if you are in an abusive relationship, you have to understand that the kinds of people who abuse other people tend to be narcissists, sociopaths, and psychopaths. Now, if you understand anything about psychology, narcissists cannot be healed. Even one of my best, most watched and listened to radio shows for the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio was an interview with H.G. Tudor, who's an avowed narcissist. And we talked about why narcissists can't be healed. And one of the interesting points that he made is that narcissists are incredibly sensitive to the issue of control. And as I mentioned earlier, the reason that people use these abusive techniques is actually to get control over you, okay? So if you're in an abusive relationship, number one, you want to recognize the signs of abuse. And then number two, you may want to face the uncomfortable fact that you're in a relationship with someone who's not a normal person, and more than likely, this other person is a narcissist, a sociopath, and or a psychopath, all right? And this is not a fixable situation. Now, I'm going to go back. I sort of bravely shared about spending 2 years of my life in a support group for battered women. And I'm a can-do person. Even today, as a medical intuitive healer, I work with clients with all kinds of challenges, you name it, including people who've suffered really decades of abuse. And it's my belief and experience that almost anything can be healed. But what you have to recognize is that if you're in a relationship with a narcissist, a sociopath, or a psychopath, those psychological pathologies cannot be healed. In other words, you can't fix that. You can't fix that person. You're not going to make a narcissist, a sociopath, or a psychopath into an empathetic, loving, caring person. They may pretend to do certain things. At the beginning of a relationship, they may love bomb you, but narcissists are not capable of love. Now, if you want to understand more about the psychology of this, there's a great book by a gentleman by the name of Lundy Bancroft. And the book is called Why Does He Do That? Inside the Minds of Angry and Controlling Men. And it may help you to understand why these individuals are so abusive and why they may have picked you. But one of the painful things, realizations that you may have to come to is that if you're in an abusive relationship, then more than likely your abuser is not a normal person, and that narcissists, sociopaths, and psychopaths, they cannot be healed, right? And you have to even step back for a moment. Even you, when you want to heal, you have to set your intention. You have to do the inner work. You have to face what's going on. And these individuals, the narcissists, sociopaths, and psychopaths, their modus operandi is to get power and control over others. That is how they live and survive in the world. And they don't want to give up their control. Now, if you are listening to this uncomfortable broadcast, I'm going to point out some resources that you can turn to, but I want to go back to that story about myself, because I was in a support group for battered women, and my husband at the time, he recognized that he had a problem, and he went to a support group for battered women. He went to a support group for men who hit people, right? So I went to the support group for women who had been abused, hosted by the wonderful YWCA, and he went to a group that helped assist men who hit people. Now, ask me if it worked. And the answer is no. And I remember that I was going to the support group for battered women. He was going for the group that helped men. At the time, I was in my early 30s, and I really wanted to have children. It was my soul longing to have children. And I remember he hit me again. And I remember getting hit in the head so hard that I woke up the next morning with my head ringing, like, you know, you rung the bell and it's reverberating. So at that point, I realized, again, this is not a fixable situation. So if you're listening to this broadcast, my heart goes out to you, and it takes tremendous courage to leave an abusive situation. So what resources can you turn to if you recognize you're being abused? In the United States, there is the National Domestic Violence Hotline, okay? And that phone number is 1-800-799-SAFE or 1-800-799-7233. Now, in England, there's the Refuge's National Domestic Abuse Helpline, and that phone number is 0808 2000 247. In Northern Ireland, there's the Domestic and Sexual Abuse Helpline, 0808 802 1414. In Scotland, you have Domestic Abuse and Forced Marriage Helpline, and that phone number is 0800 027 1234. In Wales, there is Live Fear Free, 0808 8010 800. In the UK wide, throughout UK, there's the Men's Advice Line, because men can be abused just like women. And that number is 0808 801 0327. So again, if you are listening to me, and there's basically 8 major aspects of the wheel of power and control, with physical abuse and sexual abuse on the outside. But again, if you recognize that you are being abused, realize that you yourself alone cannot solve this problem. You cannot fix your partner, okay? And there are resources with people who care and who want to help you, who can help you learn how to survive an abusive situation and possibly how you can get out of it safely. Now, I'm a medical intuitive healer. At this point in time, I'm 65 years old. I have 31 years experience in natural healing. So over the years, I have worked with countless men and women who've been abused. I'll never forget years ago working with a young man who had been raped, okay? And people often think of women being raped. Well, men can be raped also. And one of the things that abuse does is it literally tears holes in your energy field, okay? And so it's a law of physics that anytime there's a vertical electrical current, and if you're standing, you're vertical, there's a magnetic field perpendicular to that. Now, New Agey people refer to this as your aura. It's also referred to as your human energy field. So what happens is when you're being abused, that literally puts holes into your psychic protection. And so this abuse over time literally breaks you down on quite literally every level. And if you've ever seen anyone who's been abused, you know, my heart goes out to them. It really, really, but it absolutely tears holes in your energy field. As a medical intuitive healer, one of the things that I do is I actually repair holes in the energy field. So if you have holes in your energy field, one of the things that's going to happen to you is that you're going to become even more sensitive to everyone and everything around you. Now, one of the things that is true is that the preferred victim of narcissists are empaths. So there's this unfortunate dance that happens between empaths and narcissists, okay? And so you may already be a highly sensitive person, then you go into an abusive relationship and it literally tears holes in your field, and then you start becoming sensitive to everything. And I'm talking multiple chemical sensitivity, sensitivity to energy, sensitivity to other people's emotions. So you're in such a state of overwhelm and post-traumatic stress disorder that you may find it hard even to function. So again, if you're living in an abusive situation, you want to recognize that your partner is more than likely not a normal person, and that you do not have the skills to fix or change that individual. And at the end of the day, and this is hard to face, your best strategy is to actually get out. And I remember one time working with someone, and she recognized she was in an abusive relationship, and they were engaged. They'd been engaged for many years, and he would abuse her. She would leave. He would love bomb her. Then they would come back. And this was this ongoing pattern. And she told me they were going to marriage counseling to try and fix the relationship. And this individual asked me if the gentleman could come to see me, if I could help him. And I said no. And I told the person, ask your marriage counselor if narcissists can be healed. And that will tell you everything about your marriage counselor. Well, I don't know what the answer was from the marriage counselor, but that couple ended up getting married. And a couple of years later, they ended up getting a divorce because the abuse continued. And so one of the painful things that we have to recognize is that if you are in an abusive relationship, the energy of that will more than likely continue. And I know for myself, my husband hit me even before I got married. And it was I didn't know enough at that time. I just thought it would stop, or I wasn't really sure, why that happened. And I remember even a family member asking me, well, what did you do to deserve being hit? What did you do to deserve being hit? And in addition to the fact that narcissists tend to pick empaths, narcissists, sociopaths, and psychopaths also tend to choose people with low self-esteem. So more than likely, if you don't have a strong psychological self-esteem, I always say that having good self-esteem is like having a good psychological immune system. So if I know I'm a good person, if I know I'm lovable, if I know that I deserve to be treated with love and respect, then if someone starts to abuse me even once, I'm going to cut that person out of my life. And in my case, part of my healing from my abusive marriage was to recognize the abuse that I had experienced as a child, which began at a very early age. Now, my husband who abused me is now deceased, rest his soul. And I'm not going to speak about family members who abused me because they are still alive, okay? But as part of my healing, I went back and realized and faced the abuse that I had experienced as a child. And again, if you're trying to reflect on what has happened to you, by all means, go back to the wheel of power and control and ask yourself, have I experienced coercion and threats? Has someone intimidated me? Have I been emotionally abused? Have I been isolated? Have my concerns been minimized, denied, or blamed? Have people used children to get to me, or pets? Has the other individual used male privilege? Has there been economic abuse? And again, physical abuse and sexual abuse are just part of the pattern. And but more than likely, if you were abused as a child, you're set up to find a partner who abuses you because that's what you're used to. And it takes a tremendous amount of healing to realize that you don't deserve to be treated that way, and also to know and experience that you can heal. And with that, let's take another break and listen to our commercial sponsor here at UK Health Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Carrigan, medical intuitive healer, Amazon #1 best-selling author. So if you are listening to this broadcast and you recognize that you're being abused in any way, what should you do about it? Well, the first step is that you want to start talking to other people about it. And again, it can be quite painful to admit, I made a mistake in marrying my husband, right? I made a mistake. Once he hit me, even before I got married, I should have called off our engagement, right? And I remember at the time, I grew up in a pretty difficult family, and there were some things that happened in my family that were very painful, and I really wanted to have a family of my own. And I was so determined to have a family of my own that I went out and married pretty much the first guy that I found without healing that deep pattern, right? And again, if you have suffered childhood abuse, you want to do that inner work and inner healing so that you don't attract another abusive partner. So if you're being abused, you want to reach out to other people. You want to talk about what's happening. And I strongly recommend that you go to some of the resources that we talked about, the National Domestic Violence Hotline, and all those that I mentioned in the UK. If you're outside the US or UK, definitely go to Google and look up domestic violence support groups. And I attended a YWCA support group. It was a nonprofit. They absolutely saved my life. They helped me to recognize what was happening week after week, to sit there and go, oh yeah, that's emotional abuse. Oh yeah, that's isolation. Oh yeah, that's minimizing blaming. Oh yes, it may be very easy to recognize the physical abuse or the sexual abuse. Now, why is it critical to let other people know you're being abused? So at the present time, I am working with a client who's in an abusive situation. And for various reasons, she's not ready to leave yet. However, the people who are close to her absolutely know about her situation. And I've encouraged her to create a safe place so that if she feels threatened, or if her child feels threatened, that she has a place to go to. And this may be a hotel. Maybe you can afford a hotel. If you can't afford a hotel, then you want to have a friend, a loved one, or someone who cares that you could call and go to if you're in a dangerous situation. Now, if you have experienced repeated physical abuse, one of the things that you can do in the United States is you can get an order of protection. What is an order of protection? An order of protection is a legal document in which a judge orders someone to follow specific conditions or behaviors that tells that person what they can and cannot do. So for example, you can get an order of protection to keep that individual away from your house, or away from you, or away from your children. And police can make immediate arrests if they have reason to believe those conditions have been violated. Now, of course, laws vary in every country, but again, if you are in an abusive relationship and your abuser continues to try and abuse you, one of the things you can do is reach out to the legal authorities and get something like an order of protection so that you can be protected. I have a client in the UK who's a man who's been abused by his ex-wife, and she does all kinds of things, and pretty much almost everything that we have discussed in the Wheel of Power and Control. And he has reached out to legal authorities so that he can keep himself safe and also keep his children safe. Now, one of the questions you may be wondering is, if you have children, are you better off staying in that relationship or leaving it? Okay. And I mentioned how I volunteered at the shelters, right? Because in almost every city you can go to, There will be domestic violence shelters where people can go if they're being abused, and you can bring yourself and you can bring your children. And seeing what the abuse did to the children was the turning point for me. Because at the time I didn't have children, I still don't have children, but I really wanted to have children. And I remember watching these children and thinking to myself, I cannot in good faith bring a child into an abusive situation. So you have to really ask yourself and be honest with yourself, even if your child is not being hit, even if your child is not being sexually abused, even if they are not being emotionally abused, to grow up in an abusive environment, an abusive household, can be quite damaging for a child. And I can tell you, I have 31 years of experience working with people who've grown up in abusive households, and it's very, very difficult and very, very damaging. And again, it can take tremendous courage, but we have to face the fact that in life, sometimes there are situations that I can't fix, and that the smartest thing to do for me and my family to survive is to actually get out. Now, I remember as I was recovering from the abuse, as I mentioned, the abuse that I suffered actually began in childhood. It was physical abuse, it was verbal abuse. Won't go into that. I talked about the abuse that I suffered in my marriage, which included physical abuse and pretty much everything else that I mentioned. And I remember one of the best things and most smart things that I've ever read about abuse is that if you are being abused, that you have internalized that there's something wrong with you. In other words, I think there's something wrong with me, therefore it's okay for other people to hit me or to call me names or to, use money against me and so on, or threaten me, and for me to live in this state of fear and violence and intimidation. So again, one of the most important relationships that you will ever have is your relationship with yourself. And if you're being abused, realize that more than likely it's not your fault. And even if other people say to you, well, what did you do to deserve being hit? Why, what did you do to deserve being raped? Okay. And the answer is maybe there's nothing wrong with you. And part of your healing is to recognize that you are a good person and that you deserve to be treated with kindness, with love, with care, and with respect. And I know that the way that I had been programmed as a child was for me to think there was something wrong with me, that I was not lovable, that no one would ever love or care about me. It brings tears to my eyes even to think about it. So as you are listening and as we conclude this broadcast, and if you realize you're being abused, realize that it's critical for you to shift your relationship with yourself, to begin to nurture yourself. And it takes a lot of self-care to recover from abuse. It's critical for you to recognize that you're not at fault. Maybe you made a bad choice by going into a relationship with an abusive person, but most of us are not trained in in negative psychology. Most of us are not trained to recognize narcissists, psychopaths, and sociopaths. And if you're an empath, if you're a highly sensitive person, more than likely, these people have been targeting you. And so affirmations that you can use are, I deserve to be treated with love and respect. I am lovable. I am a good person. I deserve to be healed. I deserve to live in peace and harmony. And if you are being abused, I want to say from my own experience, it is possible to heal from that. I was in my early 30s when I got out of that relationship. I remarried when I was 34. I'm now 65 years old. I'm happy and I'm healthy. But again, that time in my life was a major turning point for me because I decided I want to be happy. And I look back at my life, and I think that time and that decision to become a happy person was the major turning point on which all the following success, health, and happiness was based. And if you're listening, I really encourage you to realize that you deserve to be happy, you deserve to be healthy, and you deserve to live in harmony and peace. And I encourage you to make the same decision that I did, to know that you deserve better. Definitely reach out to help. You've been listening to the Natural Healing Show for UK Health Radio. I'm your host, Catherine Carrigan, medical intuitive healer, Amazon #1 best-selling author, also abuse survivor. I don't really think back too much on that time. I do all my work prayerfully. I was told that I needed to make this broadcast. I hope that it touches your heart and it leads to your profound healing. Thank you so much for listening. You can find out more about me at catherinecarrigan.com and unlimitedenergynow.com. While you're there, definitely sign up for my newsletter so you can learn even more about how you can heal yourself naturally. See you soon. Bye-bye.